Hello and welcome to Talk It Over. Cedric Dempsey is my guest today. He is the athletic director at the University of Arizona. He came from a job in Houston, Texas, same title. More interestingly, if you go back in his biography, he was the assistant basketball coach for 2 years to Bruce Larson, and he also taught phys ed at the U of A. So we're going to talk about where the University of Arizona is going with its athletics this half hour. Stay with us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ellen. It's good to be with you.
Chatting before the show, I was struck by how much of an entertainment type person, a marketing person, a businessman, and a quasi-lawyer you have to be as athletic director, rather than an athletic director whom one would suspect would know sports very well. But your job is much more encompassing than just sports and coaches and money and equipment.
The role of the athletic director has changed dramatically in about the last decade. And Ellen, I think I can remember it when I first got into athletic administration, more years than I care to remember at this point, but it used to be that people looked upon as a public relations type of job where you did have an opportunity to get out and play a lot of golf and tennis and relate to people in that manner, and at the same time hit the cocktail circuit and then obviously run the program with coaches. But the program has changed so dramatically in the last decade and a half, and a lot of that is due to the emphasis upon winning and the necessity to fund programs. So all those things that you mentioned that are required in athletic administration today are true. In addition to that would be the necessity to raise funds, to balance the budget, and as you referred to in terms of business. And it's become a very complex business, I think, in the last 2 decades.
Let's talk right away, and we'll get this out of the realm, because everybody wants to know why you and Larry Smith, but basically you, came up with the decision to accept the NCAA sanction, to not appear on television, and to go through with it in view of the fact that USC said to the NCAA, forget it, we're going on television, we're going to go ahead with our plans. What made you decide to go along with the NCAA?
Well, we did do that collectively. We spent time talking with Larry about it as to the impact it would have certainly in the future upon his program, and Larry's had to live under the cloud of the pending probation and sanctions ever since he's been at the University of Arizona. We have an intercollegiate athletic committee on campus composed of faculty and staff and students, administrators, and we reviewed it with them. And as we looked at all the different scenarios that might happen if we decided to postpone the sanction, we felt those were far greater than the benefits that would be gained by the postponement. I think we all feel we'd like to get that period of time, that chapter of the athletic history at the university behind us as quickly as we can. We think a lot of good things are happening in our program, and that the sooner we can move out of the sanctions, the better off we are. And it is something that the university, it was a black spot time in our program, and we were guilty of some infractions, and we think we've taken the steps to overcome those kind of things, and that we have some excellent people working in our program at this time. We did not want to prolong their involvement with the sanctions. So those are probably the major factors that were in it, Ellen.
I'm sitting here thinking of a story that was told to me by one of the players who testified to the NCAA when they were investigating those infractions. And they said to the player that the player didn't like the coach. Several of the players didn't. And they said to the player, well, we're just after the coach. You won't be harming the school. And then it turned out that the school really took it in the chops. If you have a group like the NCAA who is lying basically when they're conducting an investigation, why do we have to stick with their sanction? I mean, if they're going to play dirty pool, why can't we go out there and do our thing, especially since we're no longer breaking those rules?
I'm not sure the NCAA would be lying. I'm not quite sure of the scenario you're talking about, but they did give us the option, obviously, if we wanted to move off of it. The NCAA certainly has the power to enforce the principles of amateurism as it relates to the NCAA. That was reinforced by the Supreme Court decision this summer. So they certainly have the ability to do that. I do think that many of our rules are impractical to deal with, and the NCAA's had to readjust some of its thinking in the past few months, and I think we'll continue to do that. We badly need to reorganize our rules of amateurism in this country, and as it relates to athletics and in colleges, but not only that, as we've just have seen in the Olympics that have taken place, there's a lot of hypocrisy regarding amateurism.
USC went ahead and said, we're not going to accept the sanction, we're going to do it anyway. USC is known as a powerhouse college in athletics. So if USC is doing it, why did you think they were going to come back and pick on the U of A? If they go after USC, USC will sue them and tie them up in court for years, I would imagine.
Well, there's two basic differences between where we were with our sanctions and where USC is with theirs. First of all, through semantics of their sanction, it indicated at the time which their sanctions came before the University of Arizona that they were not allowed to appear on any NCAA live television plan for a period of 2 years. So, one, they're in their second year of their sanction. That's one difference than where ours is. We were still facing 2 years of sanctions. USC is still facing 1 year of sanction. But I think where it could have ended up in litigation is the semantical interpretation of whether or not the NCAA can enforce television when it's not an NCAA television plan. Right after the NCAA delivered the opinion to USC in their sanction, they changed their wording so that said, in our case and 6 other schools in the country, they indicated that we could not appear on live television, whether it was NCAA or non-NCAA. And so I think USC was prepared to go to court on that interpretation and possibly would have stood a pretty good chance of winning. But because of that very slight difference in language in the sanction, USC felt like they had a stronger case, and I suspect they may have. But the other part of it, they only have 1 year of sanction left. Now USC will face either a sanction of television in 1985, or they will face a different type of sanction. I mean, they're not scot-free from any sanction of the NCAA. They still have 1 year. All they did was accept the postponement. As my understanding, there are 7 institutions in the country right now that have been sanctioned from television, live television, of which we are one. The 6 schools, as my understanding at this point, will go ahead and follow through on their sanction, and USC at this stage is the only one that's declared that they will postpone it.
We'll be back in a moment. Cedric Dempsey, Athletic Director at the University of Arizona, is my guest. Let's just finish up that subject because it's so important to all the fans in this area. How did you decide what were the worst things and what were the best things that could come out of whether you obeyed the NCAA sanction or not?
Well, that was a good point I did not mention, and that is we did look at what our alternatives were. We knew what we were faced with and that we still had 2 years of television sanctions. The thing that we did not know in making our decision would be if the NCAA cannot use television as a sanction, what were the alternative sanctions that we might be looking at in 1985 and 1986? We carried out different scenarios, and one of the... Did
you do role-playing?
Did
somebody get to be the NCAA?
We did a lot of role-playing on that, I think, and ran through a lot of different alternatives that might come about on it, Ellen. And the worst one, and we felt we had to take the worst scenario that could happen and weigh that versus what we knew was going to happen, was the possibility of facing 2 years of reduced number of grant and aids that would be available to our football program. And that seems to be a direction the NCAA is moving toward, is to penalize the program directly and also possibly penalize the coaches if they're involved. A lot of schools have moved to where they are fining coaches, as we did last year with the basketball situation. And we just felt that the other scenario of possibly losing as much as 20 initial awards, reducing the size of our football team by 20 in a 2-year period, would have much longer effect upon our program than the going ahead and completing our sanction this year. That, and as I say, just trying to get all that behind us as quickly as we can, were probably the 2 important factors.
Do you think they'll come back and impose anything on USC for this?
Oh, yes, yes. I don't think there's any doubt about that. USC still faces 1 year of sanctions. Whether that will be television or an alternative sanction, just to the one I just mentioned, we don't know that at this point. I do think, as I mentioned earlier, that there is still the possibility of an alternative sanction because of the wording of the USC sanction about NCAA live television plan.
Would it be advantageous if you could pick your year of sanction for the year that you had a bad team and nobody wanted to televise your games anyway? You know, well, back in 1992, we'll elect to choose that year.
In a sense, we did that last year. So we were supposed to be on or off television in 1983. And we knew we were going to have a good ball club, and what we ended up doing was signing what was called an exception telecast with UCLA last year, which, since we already had a contractual arrangement for television, the NCAA allowed us to postpone our sanction from last year. So we gambled last year and won because we ended up on television 4 times, and obviously it was financially beneficial to us. It exposed our program with a very good team, and I think helped our recruiting process. It's just how long you can continue doing that, because there's still always the cloud of the probation hanging over you, and
in your recruitment.
In the recruitment in particular. And even though people may not use it directly, there's a lot of indirect kind of comments made about attending an institution that is on probation, maybe cannot go to a bowl game or cannot appear on television, and you never know when that one little piece of information might affect a student athlete's decision.
Speaking of student athletes and amateurism and the Olympics and the NCAA, are the athletes of today in our universities, are they amateurs anymore?
Depends on how you describe an amateur, I think, in that regard, Ellen. I do feel that we badly need to redefine what amateurism is in this country, and I would solely concur with Bill Bradley, or Senator Bill Bradley's comment recently about the Olympics, and that is that we should just select athletes who are the best athletes and try to get out of the hypocrisy of determining whether they're amateurs or not. The amateur athlete of today, in particular at the Olympic level, could hardly be classified as an amateur anymore in the Puritan term as we understand amateurism. And I think it's important for us to try to redefine that, to get out of the hypocrisy of this. And I don't think it's a good learning lesson for the athletes involved. They have received monies in ways which they've had to move around the amateur rules in order for the athlete to receive the dollars. I'm not sure that's a good learning experience. I would rather us be more realistic about the amateur rule and the fact that we want to provide assistance to the top athletes of this country. Carl Lewis, who has a tremendous impact internationally upon the image of this country. If we want to help that young man pursue excellence through athletics, possibly we should do that. I think the problem always has bothered me is the hypocrisy that's involved. We say that they cannot receive money, so we find subterfuge ways of providing them with resources to continue competing.
We'll come back in a moment and we'll talk about Title IX and the Olympics and how terrifically the United States women did. Cedric Dempsey, Athletic Director at the University of Arizona, is my guest. We were talking about all the sports, etc., but let's talk about women's sports and Title IX. When Title IX became effective, you heard a lot of athletic directors and a lot of male coaches grumbling all over the country. And yet now we see that our United States women did super, just super in the Olympics. How does Title IX fit into your plans for the U of A?
Well, we've integrated our program completely in the last couple of years and really don't distinguish between men and women's sports anymore. In fact, Mary Roby, who at one time was the Associate Director for Women's Athletics, no longer carries that title. We have what we refer no sex-linked job descriptions any longer. And so our programs, we feel, are well integrated. We feel the opportunities to pursue excellence through athletics should be the same for men and for women, and I'm very excited about the growth. Olympics, I think, has really helped some of the women's sports in the last couple of decades. Probably where Title IX has helped tremendously has been the team sports. As you probably are well aware, for a number of years there were certain sports acceptable for women to compete in, tennis, golf, things of that kind, but it was not acceptable to play basketball or play volleyball or something like that. And what we have seen now is a greater acceptance of that kind of activity, and I really project now in the next few years, I think women's volleyball, as an example, is one of the best spectator sports that we have going. And I think it will, as a result of the Olympics, we will see a tremendous increase in interest in women's volleyball. Women's basketball has made great strides. The biggest problem women's basketball has had is everyone always compares it to men's basketball, and it's a different game. Someone describes it, men's basketball today we play above the rim, and women's basketball you play below the rim, and you just have to learn the differences between them, and they're both excellent games. And so I think the Olympics have helped. Obviously, Title IX provided the legal course for women to have opportunities, but the key to it is still people and the dedication that people have to giving equally the chance for men or women to compete.
What is the men's athletic budget versus the women's?
Well, we have a combined budget now, so it's about $8 million combined, and each of our sports outside of football and men's basketball have their budgets are quite equated. Almost any program today, because of its dependency upon those other two sports, men's basketball and football, are dependent upon the gate receipts from those two. So you do see always some inequalities between those two sports and the other 16 that we offer, whether it's men or women. And but if you were to go down and compare our women's track budget to our men's track budget, they're quite equal in that regard. There's very little difference between them.
How much money do you have to make off of football and off of basketball to break even?
$8 million.
To break even?
In one point, yes. And either through gate receipts, through television, fundraising. And that's one reason so many programs have had to move into fund development programs. That gate receipts and television alone is not enough to balance the budget any longer.
We'll be back in a moment. Cedric Dempsey, Athletic Director at the University of Arizona, is my guest for this show. You talked about an $8 million budget. Now, I bet you get a lot of resentment on the campus from people who are in academia who say, why should you have $8 million? Look at all the research and all the great teachers I could hire for my department with $8 million.
That's what's changed our job a great deal in the last few years. When I first got into intercollegiate athletics, many of the general budgets of the university really supported those, the athletic budget, or the funds came out of a general fund of the university, and so it was not necessary to be so concerned about generating gate receipt dollars or fundraising. But as dollars in education became tighter, they began to cut back dollars in the peripheral educational areas on a campus, and therefore we were required to generate our own income. And at this stage, we receive very little state support or university support to our program. Although the university and Arizona State both would rank very high in certainly the support that they do receive from the state. But most schools across the country have to be self-sufficient today.
How much of a budget, say, does a university like Michigan have for athletics versus the U of A?
It's almost twice as large as ours. I understand Michigan's budget this coming year is $18 million.
How do you go about recruiting against something that overwhelming?
Work harder. No, University of Michigan has a long-established program. One reason their budget is much larger than ours is they have a tremendous amount of facility upkeep in their budget, and they've had to develop. They're a separate corporation from the university, whereas we're not, and so many of their expenses are expenses that are not involved in that, and that's where when I'm talking about state support, we do get facility support and maintenance support from our facilities. Otherwise, our budget would be considerably higher than that too.
Save the best question for last. When your coaches go out recruiting, how much under-the-table recruitment do you think they face? People buying kids' cars, people promising them all kinds of stuff, and
I was afraid you were going to say, how much are they doing?
I assume that we're pure as the...
None, I hope. There is certainly some of that going on, there's no question. I think some of it is exaggerated. I think it is very common. Coaches will use that as a reason why they didn't get someone, but there's more of it going on than should be going on. I think some of the sports that we see it more prevalent. I think it's more prevalent in basketball today than it is in football. One, it takes only one or two outstanding basketball players to put your program on the map, where in football, obviously you need numbers, and so most programs wouldn't have the kind of dollars to lay out to a prospective student athlete. But I think it is a critical problem in basketball today that we have to address in this next few years, and it's a tough one. It's a tough one to deal with.
Well, I thank you for sharing this half hour with us.
Well, I appreciate being with you and your knowledge about athletics, Ellen. I think you're very knowledgeable about it.
Been to a lot of games. We'll see you out at the games this year. Support the U of A.